All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third live chat in our series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, also known as STPF. My name is Lena Rothfarb. I'm a program manager here on the STPF team, which means that I manage the relationship between fellows and the executive branch agencies where they're placed. Specifically, I get to work with our fellows who are completing their fellowships at the National Institutes of Health, NIH, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. This live chat series is an opportunity for you to ask STPF fellows your questions. We hope that through these chats, you'll see how the fellowship can impact policy and transform your career. So first, we're going to share a few housekeeping items with you all. To put today's session in context, we are hosting one chat each month during application season. We're glad you're here today, and we invite you to join us for the remaining 3 sessions. Each chat will focus on a unique aspect of the fellowship experience, and you'll get to hear from different STPF fellows at each one. Today's chat is focused on answering the question, what is it like to be a fellow? In case you haven't heard, the application is now open and it will close on November 1st. If you're wondering if you're eligible to apply or interested in the application overview, I encourage you to visit our application portal, and the link to that will be in the chat box. And there you can learn the ins and outs of our application. As a reminder, these fellowships are an opportunity for doctoral level scientists and engineers to spend a year contributing their expertise to federal policy. For 2024, there are 4 program areas that applicants can apply to: Executive, Legislative, Judicial, and unique for this cycle, the Roger Revelle Fellowship. You can apply to up to 2 of these program areas in a given year. Our fellowships are a paid 1-year full-time commitment in Washington, D.C. Just for a sense of timing, someone who applies in 2024 will be considered for a position in the fellowship class that runs from September 2025 to August 2026. I also want to briefly touch on eligibility. Applicants must be U.S. citizens, hold a doctoral degree in the sciences, social sciences, or engineering, and cannot be a full-time federal or AAAS employee. Those of you with a master's degree in engineering plus 3 years of professional engineering experience are also eligible to apply. So now on to the purpose of today's session, to chat with fellows. Please ask questions. To do that, you can click on the question box in your menu and type your question in. And if you'd like, you can indicate the person or people to whom your question is directed. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. Now I'm happy to introduce you to our fellows joining us today who are going to speak to you all. First, we have Dr. Mike O'Connor. He is with the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations in the Portfolio Strategy Division. He helps assess current gaps across the office portfolio and designs programs that can fill those gaps with specific focus on geothermal power and carbon management. Prior to working at OCED, Mike served as a AAAS Fellow in the front office of the Undersecretary for Science and Innovation and in the Geothermal Technologies Office. Mike began his career in Washington as the GSA USGS Congressional Fellow, serving in the office of Congressman Paul D. Tonko, where he covered science and natural resource issues for the congressman. Mike received his PhD in geological sciences from UT Austin in 2019. Next up, we have Dr. Stephanie Muchler, who received her PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Pittsburgh. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in renal physiology before applying for STPF. She's currently completing her fellowship in the NIH Office of Scientific Program and Policy Analysis within the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease. Finally, we have Dr. Jeffrey Keith, who earned a BS in chemistry at West Point, then served as an Army officer in Germany. After leaving active duty, Jeff obtained his PhD in chemistry at the University of California, Berkeley, and conducted postdoctoral research at Yale University. After 1 year as the AAAS Roger Revelle Fellow in Global Stewardship in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, he joined the faculty of the University of Colorado School of Medicine. In May 2023, Jeff became the executive director of the New York Structural Biology Center, one of the world's premier centers for the development and practice of integrated structural biology. So that's our panel today. Thank you again for all being here today with us. Before I go to questions from our audience, I want to kick it off with one to start for all of you. Could you each introduce yourself, your fellowship placement, and what contribution you are most proud of from your time as a fellow? Mike, are you willing to start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks. Mike O'Connor, thanks for the introduction. I'm currently in Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, acronym OSED, in the Department of Energy. And yeah, I came to this path through the fellowship. Oh, can you see me? I think I was just kicked out.
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. Yeah, I came to this path through the fellowship, where I was able to. I was kind of fortunate enough to be in the front office of the Department of Energy when it was going through some pretty massive restructuring because of the two major pieces of legislation passed by the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act and before that, and probably more pertinent to my life, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Got a front row seat basically to the way that these agencies sort of respond and react to these huge influxes of federal support from Congress, and was really excited to be a part of that. So that's how I ended up in OSED, which is an office that was stood up by that infrastructure law itself. Prior to that, the AAAS fellowship really, I milked it. I was on the Hill side before I was on the executive side, which was very cool because I got to see and be a part of the creating of the legislation that ended up becoming the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a pretty cool continuous story of being able to see ideas get put to paper, ideas get batted around by stakeholders in industry, and then ultimately implemented by the agencies. And now I'm in that seat doing the implementation. It's really it's been a spectacular ride, and very fortunate with the timing of it all, but all enabled by this program. Yeah, it was very cool.
Wonderful, thank you. Stephanie.
Hi, yeah, so I'm still in the thick of my fellowship. So I'm just finishing up the first year, and I renewed for a second year. So I'm at the NIH. I'm in the office of, I'm in the institute, the National Institute for Diabetes Diseases, which that is my background. Like, I was a renal physiologist. So I think it's been really fun for me to come in from the academic side, come into the institute that was funding my research, and get to kind of see like this other side of it. Because when I was a graduate student and then a postdoc, like, I always kind of felt like the NIH was just this black box where I would like send my stuff to and get rejected and like get this horrible feedback from. But now I realize there are actually like people there who are working really hard, and it's not the like downer side of it that I thought it was. So I think that, you know, that's been really cool. And then also the fellowship, it's so, if you have a lot of fellows have mentors who were previously fellows, so you kind of get connected into this very large network, and they understand that part of the fellowship is like not only working in your office, but reaching out and kind of finding all these other opportunities. So I've had the opportunity to be the executive secretary for an interagency working group focused on safe and inclusive STEM environments, something that was personally really like I'm very passionate about, and the kind of the focus of it right now is reducing sexual harassment and sex-based discrimination in STEM environments. And so getting to see that process, it's coordinated by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and getting to work kind of on that side of it and just have an eye on all these different things. I think that for me, that's been like the coolest part of being a fellow.
And then finally, Jeff. Oh, we can't hear you, Jeff. Are you on mute?
Oops, sorry. There you go. Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Kieft. I go by Jeff. And as you heard, you know, I did my fellowship more than 20 years ago. So, you know, in between 2001 and 2002, and I was the Roger Revelle Fellow in Global Stewardship. And it was a great opportunity, right? So it was an opportunity that I decided to I don't know, attempt or try and take advantage of between my postdoc and having my faculty position, in part because I had some background in areas outside of science when I was in the military. And I kind of wanted to bring some of those, I don't know, leadership attributes or things I learned in the military to bear within the scientific realm, and thought, well, let's check out what science policy is about and see if maybe was a career path for me. So I ended up in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and you know, the fellowship was really kind of broadly defined as it's the fellowship in global stewardship. And so the idea is that it has somewhat of an environmental bent. And so I worked on things related to climate change and the coastal eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico because of over-fertilization, and a lot of things related to the environment. But because I was actually in the AAAS headquarters on September 11th, when the attack occurred at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, during my fellowship, a big part of what we also ended up doing is a lot of interfacing with other agencies and other parts of the federal government in terms of, you know, what does security look like in the future? What technology should we be employing? What would work? What would not work? And so I very rapidly had to get a much higher security clearance, and I got to see a lot of technologies that were being developed that other people didn't get to and talk. So that was really exciting. I don't know what I'm most proud of. I guess I just learned a whole lot. I think one thing that I don't know if this is what I'm most proud of, but was probably the most unusual thing I got to do is, you know, I don't know if you all remember or heard about when there was an anthrax scare, right? Anthrax spores were released in the Hart office building, Senate office building. I became the liaison between the cleanup crew there on site and the White House. And so every day I would get briefings and I'd write them up, and they'd go to the president's press secretary, and you really felt like you were on the cutting edge or in the front lines, right? Because you were seeing things before they did. So I don't know if that's what I was most proud of, but it was a lot of fun, right? And so, yeah, so I'll stop there, and hopefully there'll be some great questions.
That's great. So I see we have some audience questions coming in. So for the remainder of the questions, we don't have to go in any particular order. Feel free to jump in any order that you guys want. So our first question is, did you have a specific policy area in mind that you wanted to explore before you applied for the fellowship or you were placed in an office, or did that develop after you started and had already sort of gotten into your office?
I can jump in and say, you know, I think when I first started, I thought, well, I better have something that a policy area that I want to pursue or that I'm interested in. Of course, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy really is kind of this bird's eye view of science that's going on all across the executive branch, and it's kind of the center for coordinating of new initiatives in that. So even though I came in with some ideas, there was clearly, you know, some agendas and some things that were already in place from the president's science advisor that we were going to work on. But what I found really is that if you are creative and you have something that's important to you and you start knocking on doors and talking about it, people will listen to you often, and they will say, oh, that is important. That is something we should be thinking about. And so I very rapidly had to adapt because, you know, I'm not the president and I'm not the president's science advisor. But I found very quickly that, you know, if one is creative, you can often move things or open up new lines of inquiry that weren't there when you arrived.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I get, so I went into it, so I was actually getting my master's degree in public health policy. And so and like with a background in renal physiology, I was very passionate about chronic care management. But what I found is that like once I went for my interviews, it was a great topic to get started on, talking about, you know, why I was interested in policy and how it could make things better for this group of people that I cared about. But at the same time, I think it's very important that you not be wed to the idea that you're going to just work on one thing because of exactly what Jeff just said, which is that things happen, you may need to pivot, and you don't want to be upset and feel like your fellowship experience isn't, you know, what you thought it was going to be just because you're not working on that one topic area. Like I would highly recommend like thinking about it much broader, like I'm interested in public health, and like just be happy that, oh, hey, I'm working on public health. Because it may kind of circle back to what you're interested in, but along the way, if you're not like willing to kind of and go down these different paths, you might miss a lot of really cool opportunities that let you eventually get back to where you want to be. But you would kind of like, you'd stick to the straight and narrow, then it can kind of blind you, I think.
That's helpful, thank you. And then Mike, I know that your camera's not working, but it sounds like you're still with us. So would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, happy to. I think I was really interested in trying to figure out how to take my geological science, knowledge and put it to practice in real life. I was one of those scientists that got into science because I wanted to like do some real world problem solving, and I was eager to use that knowledge really to tackle the climate crisis. And so that's been a major focus from the beginning, which is why I picked the congressman that I did. He was the subcommittee chair on the Committee on Environment and Climate Change, so we got to work on really targeted legislation there. And then the Department of Energy. Yeah, it was a clear focus from the moment I jumped in.
Great. All right, our next question is a two-parter. So first of all, what does the day-to-day work look like as a fellow? And secondly, when you're contributing to a bill or a policy initiative, what does that look like?
I can start. So this was something, the day-to-day workings of what a fellow does. This was like my biggest jolt in starting the fellowship. A lot of the positions are now remote. So a lot of the government is working from home. And this was my first time ever just being in my house, working on a computer and not being in a lab, being up all the time, moving around, talking to people. So that was definitely a big change. As far as the workload day to day, everything kind of goes in cycles. For me, I work a lot on budget. The budget is due, or when the appropriations committee is meeting, then I suddenly have a lot of work. There's a lot of 24-hour deadlines. You have to get technical assistance back to people really fast. And so you're kind of like constantly looking at your computer. But then at other times, like right now, everyone's kind of on vacation. So things are like a little bit slower. And I think though that as a fellow, like, and just as like a government employee in general, you have a lot more, at least I feel like outside of the lab, there's like a little bit more, at the beginning of the day what you can kind of expect, and then you're just like filling in the holes along the way. And I think that's very fellow specific, depending on what office you're in. But I would say that moving from research to the fellowship, it's a lot more, it's more of that 9-to-5 job that I kind of wanted to try out and get that feel of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I would say, I think this probably is a tough question to answer in a general sense, because I think it really depends on kind of what office you're in and what you're doing. I mean, I had colleagues that were fellows they were congressional fellows, and so what they would experience on a day-to-day on the Hill was probably very different than someone who is working in the Department of Energy or NIH like Stephanie is, and might have a more, focused portfolio that they're digging a little more deeply into that. I found a lot of my days were pretty fluid, a lot of meetings, but not boring meetings talking about kind of pretty interesting things, and on a diverse range of topics. But then other days when I was really in front of my computer just writing, like working on a white paper or reading things or educating myself on some topic. And then there were other times when one of the more senior members of the office, they would be going in front of a congressional committee for testimony, and we had to prep them, right? So we'd act like we were senators or representatives and ask them all these questions. So it was, very fluid, but I think it really depends on what is your portfolio, what in the office that you're in.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's very much portfolio specific and job specific. And I had 3 different jobs as fellow and had 3 different lives. I think the only thing that is really true about it is that everything you're going to do is intensely collaborative. And I don't say that in like a value judgment, positive or negative. It's just you work in as a piece of a system in the government, and there is a stark change between how you produce work in academia, which is often to sit for a week or two and work on something on your own, and then maybe share it, versus if I haven't talked to somebody about the thing I'm doing that day, I've probably gone too far. You really need to make sure that because we work really closely with a lot of other offices that have interest in equities. We work really closely with outside groups that have a lot of opinions on this sort of stuff. You're a piece of a system, and I think that's the biggest change that I've noticed.
Well, that leads us nicely into our next question, which was, what were the most significant challenges you faced when transitioning from a research-focused role to a policy-focused fellowship? And along with that, how did you navigate the learning curve and adapt to the new demands of a policy environment?
That's a good question. What was different? Actually, I think my answer would be kind of building on what I think all of us just said, is that, you know, if you're in a research environment or an academic research environment, you kind of are going in and you're focused on your thing mostly. You know, you've got your set of experiments, and yeah, you collaborate with people, but it's really, you know, kind of an individual endeavor. Whereas in the government, everything is consensus, or everybody wants to know everything. It's like, oh, you know, here's this question, this problem we've got to solve. What do we need to do? Oh, we better convene an interagency working group, right? And then you figure out who are the 50 people, or maybe not that many people, all the people that are going to join that committee or that working group to start talking through the problem. And in order to kind of make that happen, when you first get there, you don't know who to call or what the process is. And process is really a big deal, I learned in Washington, right? The way that something gets done really matters. Who's involved in it, and who has a voice, and who are the stakeholders, and making sure they're all around the table. And so I kind of had to adapt to that, because I was the kind of guy that I went to the lab and I had my experiments and I was good at them and I cranked out data. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, everything's got to be a group effort, a committee, a process. And it takes a little while to figure out how to do that and to think that way, I think.
Yeah, and I think with that group effort, the thing that's been really eye-opening for me in my workflow management is the fact that everything has to go through clearance, and there's like 5 steps of clearance. So when you have a deadline, you know, in academia, you're rushing, you're working up until the end, like you submit it the day that it's due and you don't think anything of that. But in government, you have to plan it out. I have to get it, I have to send it to this person, they have to have time to read it. Then I have to incorporate their edits, I have to send it to this person. So I think that was like a very different style of working, like planning from the back and like getting those deadlines all figured out. And then I think the other thing is the definition of what an expert is. So in academia, in order to be an expert at something, you know, you've been working on the same small focused topic for 10 or 20 years. And you know everything about that topic, you know about things that are adjacent to it, and you're just so focused on this one thing. But in the government, I feel, you know, at first I felt very nervous about talking about things that I didn't feel I was an expert in, but you're a generalist. You're going to kind of read on something for a few days, you're going to get up to maybe even a few hours, get up to speed, and then you kind of need to talk about it like you understand it, like you are an expert, because for the level that you're needed, sometimes like your knowledge is expertise. So I think kind of opening that up and thinking of yourself that way is really important.
Well, and I think this is super related to why everything's collaborative. The system is such that nobody gets to be an expert on everything. All people get to do is decide who they trust, right? Who gives you good information, who gives you bad information, who does things well and who does things rushed. And I think that's why process matters. That's why consensus is important, because none of us have time to do the original work on our own and get it done. You are building a pyramid of trust around all the sources that you think are going to give you the right information to do the right job, and that's all you got time to do.
Great. All right, our next question is, what particular experiences or skills did you come into the fellowship with that you feel made you successful in the fellowship?
I think designing a PhD from scratch is an unbelievable experience in all these cases, right? The starting from nothing and building something and then communicating it is often what you do in the government, right? There's a problem and not really sure how to solve it and what to do about it. Are you going to use government dollars to fund a solution? Are you going to issue a request for more information? And if so, what are you going to ask them? All this stuff. I think you just got to get used to the idea that you're doing that process quicker with more people. But I think that's the process in a lot of the things that I do.
I think one thing that I found useful, and again, this is maybe somewhat dependent on what office or position one ends up in, but was that, you know, growing up, I had a pretty diverse set of interests in science. You know, I eventually got my PhD in chemistry and, you know, kind of went into structural biology and biochemistry, but always was just kind of interested in all kinds of scientific things. And that proved really useful in an office where, you know, you kind of didn't know what the next scientific thing that might come across your desk was. You know, I worked a lot when I was in the office on climate policy and climate change. I have no background in meteorology or anything really related to that, but I know thermodynamics, and I know a little bit about the environment and all that. And you know enough that, like Stephanie says, what is considered an expert in the office is often far less depth of knowledge. It's almost more just, you know how to think like a scientist. You understand how science works, and you understand how we know what we know and how we know what we don't know, because you'd be amazed at how many people in prominent positions in Washington don't even understand the scientific process. They don't see how it's any different from just what you believe. And so being the person in the room that can think about, well, you know, we need data to support this, and here's how we could get the data, here's who we could ask. Thinking like a scientist and having a little bit of breadth in your scientific knowledge was really useful to me right away.
That's great, thank you.
I would say ability to come back from failure is something that I think everyone learns in the lab. You always have experiments that don't work, your hypothesis isn't right, and so as a scientist, you know, I think we're trained to look at failure as just part of the process and say, okay, well, that didn't work, but what do I do next? And I realize in working, especially with lawyers, that failure is like the end for them. Like, that does not work. And so they can't sometimes see beyond the fact that, okay, this didn't work, but we can try this. So I think that having that skill to just like look at failure as part of the process and not the end of the process is really helpful in all parts of the job.
Those are all great answers, thank you. Our next question is for the two of you who are alumni of our program. So how did the work you did during your fellowship time and the things you learned in your fellowship help you in your careers from that point onward?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that it did make a little bit of a difference right after I started my faculty position, right? So I went from the fellowship and then I started as an assistant professor at the University of Colorado. I was immediately tapped to sit on committees dealing with like, oh, how do we get more funding from the office or the Department of Homeland Security? Should the university be doing research in, you know, bioterrorism and things like that, and what did I know about it? So to a certain degree, it was nice to have that knowledge, because then everybody thought I was an expert, and I, you know, got to know leadership at the university. So that was a real pragmatic thing. But I think over time, you know, one of the things that I learned from it is how to work with people who have very different motivations or different stakeholders. You know, when you're working on a policy in Washington, you know, some of the people that you may be interacting with are less concerned about the science than they are about the economic impact, or what is this going to do for small businesses, and and you learn how to talk to those people, and then those are skills that are going to carry over into anything, I think, in life, whether you go into academia or anything else. Just understanding, people come with different perspectives, and being able to listen to them and trying to integrate that and build consensus can help, I think, in any role afterwards. And it certainly helped me even as a professor, just being able to look at someone and say, well, not everyone in the room has the same motivations I do or the same interests. And that was helpful, I think. So I learned that.
I think the path for me was abundantly obvious. Like, it got me my next job. It got me all the contacts I needed for the next job. It helped me understand where I wanted to be in the massive organization of the federal government. It helped me understand that I did want to be in the federal government. And when I was hired, it was a hit the ground running situation, right? It wasn't, I didn't need to be retrained to do anything, because I was pretty ingrained in the system already. I think there's maybe a little bit of a misconception out there that when you're a fellow, your job is in some way different from the others around you in the office doing things. It has never been my experience that my job was any different from any of the permanent feds that were on the staff or anything like that. I had effectively the same job as a GS-13 grade researcher. That's how they treated us in all of my jobs. So really, not much of a shift. The shift was becoming a fellow from academia in the first place.
That's great, thank you. Our next question is, what is one preconceived notion you had about the federal government going into the fellowship that you learned was not right once you were a fellow? Or that you adjusted once you were a fellow?
Things move slowly. Maybe I don't know if I knew that or suspected that before or not, but I definitely learned that things move slowly.
I think there's a lot of expertise in the government that I didn't expect to see.
Yeah.
Like the litany of career professionals in scientific and technical fields that work in the government is kind of astounding, because they don't really publish that often. They don't really go to that many conferences. They're kind of on like, it's kind of not their goal to be known, right? But it's a pretty impressive roster.
I would say for me, the thing that learning to most understand that was maybe I had a misconception about when I came in was the difference between policy and politics. And being in the executive branch, you learn very quickly that you are expected not to be involved in politics, but your job requires it in some ways. So I think that for me, just learning about what a massive operation the government is and when you need to like understand the difference in very subtle things like that in order to kind of make your way around it, that was very surprising to me.
Thank you. All right, our next question is, how do you balance different professional interests during your fellowship? For example, this person wanted to know about emerging technologies and workforce development. So if anybody has anything on that topic to share.
I'm not sure I know I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess sort of the question is like, if you have sort of different interests than maybe what your office is working on, how do you sort of balance developing sort of those interests with what your office is asking of you?
I mentioned being the executive secretary of an IWG. That's a great way to kind of get out, and actually the opportunity came to me through the AAAS listserv. So if you're kind of just networking with people and talking, and if something in your fellow placement interviews, if you like talk to your office about and say, hey, I have this interest in this, you know, like I also have a huge interest in nutrition. And so I'm working with the Office of Nutrition because our offices do work together, and they actually were kind of looking for someone to liaison between the two, but they didn't want to throw that on a fellow, but I was like happy to take it on. So I think that if you're open about having kind of separate interests, people will help you explore that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. I think that's a good answer, and it's a good point. Is that you know, you meet all these other fellows when you come in, which is great, right? I'm assuming still it's like this 2 or 3 week or however many week program at AAAS when you start, which was just amazing, right? I learned so much in those weeks that would have made the fellowship worthwhile. But you also meet all your fellows or your colleagues, and then they go all over the government. So you kind of already have this network, and then there's former fellows that are working in the government permanently. And you can really take advantage of that if you have an idea or have a thought and you're like, wow, you know, maybe I should talk to someone over on the Department of Energy over there. Who do I know? Well, you probably know someone you met during the first 2 weeks of your fellowship or someone who was a fellow. And so if you take advantage of that network and you learn that there's that network out there and build your network, you can often start almost your own mini projects just by talking with people and say, hey, you know, if your boss is interested in this and my office isn't interested, we should talk about doing something, and you know, and who knows what will come out of it. So I think there are opportunities out there for people that are, if you're in a fellowship position, for people that are, I don't want to say ambitious, but you know, have their eyes open for ways that they can make a difference outside of maybe what they've already been assigned to. And those were the people I think that ended up having some of the best experiences, is the people who are willing to do that.
That's great. Mike, anything else on that one, or should we go to the next one?
No, I think I just want to plus up on both of those. The Fellows Network is real. It is valuable. Yeah, it's good.
On that note, did any of you get involved with any of the fellow affinity groups, or were there any sort of particular professional development activities or programming that you'd like to highlight as part of your experience?
We had happy hours quite a bit. I'll say that. We would email each other and say, like, which awesome bar are we going to go to this Friday? And a bunch of fellows would just meet up and talk about their experiences. So that was mostly what I did, to be honest.
Weekly happy hours. So that is always a good place. And then with the affinity groups, so I'm actually a co-chair for the agri-nutrition affinity group, the Agri-Nuts. And so that's, in my mind, it was a cool group to join because it's kind of taking a lot of fellows from the USDA, a lot of fellows from NIH who work on very different things, but pulling them together and kind of, you know, we do a lot of farm tours, sustainable agriculture. And then we also have been looking at kind of food pantries, food insecurity. And we've been kind of looking at all these programs that connect the two. And there's this huge role where the government could step in and kind of help with some of those programs. So I think that having a group like that, where it brings together fellows with very different interests, it's been really, it's taught me so much about agriculture. I mean, I grew up on a farm and I didn't even know most of these things. And so, you know, there are so many opportunities like that to get involved and just kind of explore new things.
That's great. I have an optional question for Jeff, depending on if you can speak to this or not. So how would you describe your experience as a Revell Fellow in particular? Could you offer any advice for applicants interested in the Revell program area?
Ooh, good question. It was great. I mean, it was one of the, you know, one of those 1 years in my life that I learned so much and I experienced so much. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things about the Revell Fellowship is that, assuming it's still the way, you know, still administered the way it was when I did it, is that you actually have to have postdoctoral experience, right? So you had to be a little more senior, had to have, and also I think when I was interviewing, they were really looking for me to demonstrate some level of breadth in my scientific thinking, and just some leadership experience or something that said, okay, you are ready to maybe step into a little bit larger role when you start out as a fellow than what some might, who might be just fresh out of a PhD and not have that as much experience. Now, how you show that, that's another thing. I did years ago sit on review applicants for the Revelle Fellowship, and they were a very diverse group, and I think that was in terms of their backgrounds and everything. So and I'll also say, I was selected for the fellowship, even though I would not say I had a background in ecology or anything that was really environmental. I was a chemist, but I had an interest in molecular biology. I'd worked in genetics and could talk a little bit about the relationship between how genomes might change as the environment changes. And they thought, oh, that's kind of cool. But the other cool thing about it is you get to choose where you go. At least when I was a Revelle Fellow, you kind of found where you wanted to be, everything from a non-governmental organization to White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I could have gone into a congressional office, kind of anywhere that can take you. And so you have to spend some time actually talking to people in all these different offices to find out, where do I really fit? What should my experience look like? What do I want the next year to look like? And so you already meet a lot of people when you're doing that. And so I had like kind of a little network already when I started as a fellow, and that was a great part of it. But, again, it's one of those things where it's kind of what you make out of it. There were a lot of things about it I could never have predicted. But, you learn so much, and you really throw yourself into it. You gain so much that's going to be useful throughout your career. It was a great experience. And I'm excited to see that it's continuing this year. So
do you have any advice for someone applying to the Roger Fellowship?
I guess don't limit yourself by looking at it and say, I don't have a background in environmental science, so I'm not going to be eligible for this global stewardship. Think creatively about what the science and experiences the science you've done and the experiences that you've had, how you could apply them, thinking about global stewardship broadly, right? Because it's not just about, water and air and climate change. It's about all aspects of how human beings interact with their environment and how it's changing and our influence on it. And so, don't be afraid to be creative and apply, even if you don't think you're necessarily eligible, apply for it and do your best. So
that's great advice. So our next question is related a little bit to something that Stephanie touched on earlier. We're referring to, working with lawyers in the government. So during your fellowship, did you collaborate with non-scientists? And if yes, could you tell us about what that was like and what you learned about that? Any of you, not just Stephanie.
I can start since I did disparage lawyers a little bit. Yeah, so I think, lawyers are a great example of one group that you are going to come across. That is by far like the highest representation of people that I work with right now. I think the other group of people though, that I work with that I think this is why it's so important to have scientists in government, is that right now I'm working on a lot of policy for science. So that includes a lot of things related to STEM education, including graduate education. And in these interagency working groups, when you have, you're kind of pulling in people with a bunch of different expertise, a lot of them didn't go to graduate school. So they don't actually, there are very simple things that as someone who has gotten a PhD, you think about how much it impacted your life, the fact that graduate students don't have HR. Like that when you were a graduate student, like it consumed you. And so I think that that's where it's really important that the scientists then use storytelling to kind of say, well, as a graduate student, these things, this is how it impacted me, and this is something that would have helped me. So I think that, even having the experience of being in graduate school, it brings something to the table. And I think that storytelling is a really powerful way to connect with people, just sharing your own experience.
That's great.
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, definitely. I had to interact with, I shouldn't say I had to, I did interact with a lot of non-scientists in the job. And, again, exactly what Stephanie said, you just have to recognize that, they come from a different background, are approaching the table or the room, the issue from a very different perspective. And, and learn how to talk to them about that, but also, not from a place of condescension or well, I'm the scientist and I know so much and you all should just be listening to me.
Yeah.
But really listening and realizing, if you're in academia, we become very comfortable with the idea that science has all the answers, right? If you just do the right experiments and you get everything, you have the right answer and everyone should listen to you. But that's not necessarily the case in Washington, D.C. There's people can come at what they think the right answer is from very different perspectives. And, I think I was told early on, that your job as a scientist in government is to provide information, to lay out the arguments, but ultimately the decision makers will make the decision based on what they want to make it. And that could be something as much as, well, my constituents back home don't like that. I won't get reelected, so I'm not going to do it. And you've got to recognize that, okay, I'm not the decider. I'm the information giver. I'm the analyzer. I can tell you everything I know from a scientific perspective. But that doesn't mean you're going to rule the day in Washington, D.C.
And I also I echo the point that it's not just that you can't talk from condescension. It's that like science actually ends up becoming a very small part of a lot of the discussions that I'm having right now in my day-to-day life about getting new technologies to be deployed out in the country, right? Some of our new clean energy technologies that scientists may have successfully developed through experimentation and in the lab scale and all that. It's ready to go and looks that way. And now the problem is the science there. The science is clearly there. The problem is everything else. And the everything else is a whole lot harder than the science at some level, or more important to getting the job done. And science becomes a relatively small factor. That's a large part of our government, is trying to make sure that, sure, you can draw a network that optimizes the where you'd want to put this pipeline, for example. Where we can draw this network and you can optimize for 1,000 conditions, and those conditions don't mean anything if you don't get the permit. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a piece of the decision making, and depending on where you go in the government, I think it can be a relatively small piece, where you're using your scientific thinking strategies, but not necessarily thinking about science.
Yeah. All right.
At that point,
Oh,
sorry. I'm just going to add one thing. So to Mike's point, that science is a very small part of it. Also, science, the way we think of science. So a big push in, at least in health, and I'm thinking climate change too, is the addition of indigenous knowledge. So viewing science as something beyond just science in the lab. And so if you're interested in kind of thinking of different ways to communicate science and working in partnership with other people, I'd highly recommend looking into indigenous knowledge sources, because that's something at the NIH that we're very much thinking about how to engage with those communities.
That's wonderful, thank you. So our next question is, what would you say was your greatest area of growth during the fellowship?
It's a good question, and I think I know I'm a totally different professional person. I do know that because of it. I'm trying to think of how to quantify that. I'm really proud of the collaborative skills I was able to build. Mm-hmm. I think those were really important, and I didn't really have them walking.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree with that. Maybe the collaborative skills or kind of, one of the things that I was really interesting to me that I'd noticed very early on when I was there is how some people could sit down in a room, some leaders, and they'd be chairing a committee or something, and everything seemed to go well. There was a sense that we were going to get to a good place. There was good discussion, and they seemed to just be able to build trust with everyone in the room and among the people in the room. And then other meetings you would go into, and it just seemed contentious. And even though, and so I kind of started studying how is it that that one person was just able to get people moving in the same direction, even if they disagreed. And you'd leave the room saying, okay, we didn't solve everything today, but we're moving in the right direction, or at least or this is a dead end, we have to try something else, but we all believe that that was, true. And so I guess maybe over time, by kind of subconsciously or even deliberately studying that, it helped me to try and to become a person where I thought like, okay, now maybe I can lead discussions in a more effective way. I don't know that it was kind of maybe an evolution, but I would say I left the fellowship maybe better at consensus building and some leadership skills that I didn't have before, in terms of dealing with very diverse people or people with very diverse perspectives and opinions.
That's great.
I think for me, so I think that I had been so focused on, in the lab as a graduate student and a postdoc, you're expected to live in lab. Like, you think about your experiments all the time. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to do this thing. And you just go and do it. And so I think that, for 12 years, my life was just science. And so I think it was very humbling to go from this place where, I was in charge of a group of 10 people and I was, being asked to do all these things all the time, and then starting over in this job where I didn't know anything. I think that for me, like, that experience and learning how to ask for help, because sometimes I feel like, in academia, you're not always encouraged to go to people when you need help. You need to figure it out yourself. And so learning how to, tell people, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, can you please just give me a little guidance here? And also, like, I think that, being a part of such a bigger operation, you kind of, it's not that you don't matter, but it's just that you don't feel all this pressure on you to, like, you're not this sole person, doing this thing. And if you fail, then, like, the world is over. So I think that that's let me explore a lot of those other interests that I have, look at agriculture and climate change and how that's affecting health. And so I think that, just having, like, giving myself the possibility to do that was really awesome as part of the fellowship.
That's great. All right, well, sadly, we have come up upon the hour. So I have just one more question for our panelists today. If you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself at the time that you applied for this fellowship?
I would I'd say don't hesitate. I think I thought too long about whether I should apply for one or not, and it's great. And I will say I've had actually people in my lab that have graduated with their PhD and gone on to do AAAS fellowships, and I've interacted with some. So I always give the same advice. If it looks intriguing to you, apply. It'll be a great experience if you get one, guaranteed.
Yeah, I agree. I think even if politics becomes something that feels a little toxic, I actually think that the year or two you get to spend in here, I served in 2019, and politics was pretty toxic then, and I really learned a lot, because what you see in the front lines, it does permeate down to some degree, a little bit to what you do in the daily life, but not a lot. In the middle of two impeachments, we were writing up the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was a very interesting split screen. But the government is doing a lot at all times. And I think even if the headlines are discouraging to you, I encourage you to apply.
I would say don't be afraid to ask for help. So like we've said many times, AAAS fellows have a huge network. If you search for AAAS fellows on LinkedIn, tons of people will come up. And honestly, I think most people love getting messages from people who are thinking about applying to the fellowship. So if you have any questions or concerns along the way, you can, and even if you just want to know more about what it's like to be a fellow, and you know, I think we brought this up too, every office is so different. Everyone has such a different experience. So just if you want to hear more from any particular agency, just look people up on LinkedIn and reach out.
All right, well, those are wonderful pieces of advice. Thank you all for coming today. All of you, our attendees, our panelists, and thank you to our attendees for asking really great questions today. As a final reminder, our application is open through November 1st. You can visit our website to read more about the program, and we'll also send you a recording of this chat in the coming days. As a final reminder, the next chat in our series will take place on August 20th. If we couldn't get to your question today, you can email us at fellowships@AAAS.org, and you can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and all socials. And we will continue the conversation over there. So again, thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.